The first thing I think of when I think of Halloween in the 80s were those plastic masks.
Kind of scary, isn't it?
You could be He-Man, Casper, Frankenstein, just about anyone.
I want a mask. Can I have a mask?
The masks were held onto your head by this little white elastic rope, usually stapled to the mask at each end. That elastic came loose on several of my plastic masks because the staples, they really didn't hold that well.
So cheap.
I also had to pull the mask up on my head several times to breathe and see. They weren't easy to breathe in, and the eye holes of the mask didn't always line up with my eyes. Here's a great 80s costume.
Dracula.
I wore a Dracula costume for several years in a row. It was my favorite. A black cape with white plastic fangs. They were super uncomfortable and they filled up my mouth, but I thought they were pretty cool anyway. When the glow-in-the-dark ones came out, I was really in heaven. Well, actually, I wasn't because I was Dracula. And Dracula probably isn't in heaven. And who can forget the school costume parades? At my elementary school, they would start with the lower grades and every kid would go through every classroom showing off their costumes. There were no limits back then. Kids dressed up as everything and wore whatever masks they wanted. They also brought all kinds of props to school. Props that you would not get away with bringing to school today. Those parades were fun.
Those were the days.
I looked forward to pulling out the Halloween decorations every year. At our house, we didn't get too fancy. I vaguely remember a skeleton on our front door, and we'd carve jack-o'-lanterns for the outside steps. I think a lot of neighbors would decorate their doors back then with skeletons, witches, and ghosts. They were all over the place. Trick-or-treating was a lot of fun. Our gear usually consisted of a plastic bucket when we were young, and as big of a pillowcase as we could find when we were older. There were some kids in the neighborhood, usually the middle school kids, that didn't want to do the work or were a little too old for trick-or-treating, so they looked for kids to grab candy from and run. That happened to my brother once at a park with his friend. They were cutting through the park to get to a neighborhood on the opposite side, and they were hit by the candy snatchers. He had a rare comic book in his bag that he lost to the snatchers. It was given to him from one of our neighbor friends who wanted to give him a little something special. I remember him coming home in tears. Poor guy. For the older crowd that didn't trick-or-treat, there were some pretty creepy movies for rent at Blockbuster or Hollywood Video. The popular ones back then, at least the ones that I remember the most, were Nightmare on Elm Street,
Don't fall asleep.
and Child's Play.
Hi, I'm Chucky. Wanna play?
I don't think there's anyone in the 80s that didn't know who Freddy Krueger and Chucky were. Does anybody remember this?
I can't believe that there's a nightmare on my street.
I'm your DJ now, Crazy.
Halloween was a ton of fun in the 80s. It was a lot different than it is today. Did you experience Halloween in the 80s, or do you know someone who experienced Halloween in the 80s? Let me know in the comments. I would love to read your stories. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.